Okay, so this discrimination and segregation against the African Americans did not end with the Civil War. It continued following the Civil War and Reconstruction. It didn't just say, oh, magically we're done, we're fixed. Things still changed. So this is what life was like post-Reconstruction throughout the United States for African Americans. Okay, so key idea that you need to know about this. In the late 19th century, the 1800s, discrimination and segregation against African Americans intensified and took on new forms. So slavery was now illegal, but other forms of discrimination still existed. African Americans also disagreed about how to respond to this discrimination. There were a lot of laws to limit African American freedoms that we've talked about before. Poll tax. This discriminates not only against African Americans, but against poor whites. You had to pay a certain amount of money in order to vote. So if you were poor, you could not pay for it or vote even. Literacy test. So in order to go vote, you had to prove that you could read and write. Well, this also discriminated against poor whites and African Americans because education was not widely participated in by many people at this time. Public education didn't really pick up until the late 19th century and didn't become mandatory until the 20th century. So the main people who were literate during this time were richer white people. And then the grandfather clause, which means that if your grandfather could not vote, you cannot vote. And if you cannot vote, your grandchildren cannot vote. And if your grandchildren can't vote, your grandchildren's grandchildren can't vote. So it's a cycle. Very easy to discriminate against the African Americans and pretty much anybody who was poor. So the problem. After Reconstruction, many southern state governments passed these Jim Crow laws forcing the separation of the races in public places. The laws were named after a black man in a Southern song who sang and danced for white people. Another theory on how Jim Crow came about was that it was a white actor in the South who would paint his face black and act in stereotypical black ways, very discriminatory against African Americans. Intimidation and crimes were often directed against African Americans with the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan and many other discriminatory groups. The laws were enforced by both local police and mob violence that sometimes led to the lynching of blacks. And this was all over the United States. This wasn't just in the South. So African Americans looked to the courts to protect their rights and enforce the Civil Rights Amendments. Remember the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13 was free, 14 was equal, 15 was vote. So a man named Homer Plessy, who was an African American, tried to challenge the idea that he was equally protected under the law because he had to use separate public facilities. But the court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment because as long as they were equal, it's all okay. Now, you and I both know that it really wasn't equal, but nobody followed up on that. They were like, yeah, separate is okay. So therefore, the Jim Crow laws stayed in effect. During the early 20th century, African Americans began what became known as the Great Migration to the northern cities in search of jobs and to escape poverty and Jim Crow discrimination in the South. Well, they didn't entirely leave segregation and discrimination. So with the lure of jobs and promises from the North, many African Americans left the South and settled in northern cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. Most of these people were in their early 20s, with many growing up in rural southern towns before moving and settling up in the North. This is the map that shows most of the Great Migration. So if you were on the eastern coast, you tended to go to the East Coast major cities. Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. If you were further into the Deep South, you tended to go to Detroit, Columbus, Cincinnati. And if you were far over in Texas or Louisiana, you tended to go to Minneapolis or all the way out to California and San Francisco and Los Angeles. So this was the time that many African Americans faced great injustices, and they disagreed about how to respond to this discrimination. Booker T. Washington believed that the way to equality was through vocational education and economic success. So vocational education means technical education. You're being trained in a trade. He accepted social separation. He saw segregation as okay because if you look at the United States, look at it like you look at your hand. You have 5 separate fingers that can work separately, but they all come together to make one hand. So all of the people of the United States work separately like the fingers, but we all come together to make one hand. He believed in industrial education for blacks, and he provided it at his Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama. He felt that blacks could achieve good lives if they were properly prepared for the industrial jobs that were in demand. He was seen as a man of his times. He wasn't really thinking, how do we change this 10, 20, 50 years in the future? How do we get jobs now? How do we get some sort of footing now? So getting educated at the Tuskegee Institute, it wasn't about science or social studies. It was about how can I be trained in a certain trade? So whether that was factory work or blacksmithing or various other trades, it was you were getting trained to do something. You weren't getting trained necessarily on how to keep going to school. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, believed that education was meaningless without equality. He believed in full education, English, math, science, all that stuff, for everybody. He supported political equality for African Americans, and he really fought for it with the National Association of the Advancement for Colored People, or the NAACP. He disagreed with Washington's plan of blacks settling for low-class industrial jobs. He thought they should aim better. He didn't think that blacks would achieve their potential or compete with whites with only factory jobs. They needed more. He was seen as a man ahead of his times, and by that he was thinking in the future, how do we change this for not just us, but for our children and our grandchildren? Du Bois supported his desire for political equality for African Americans by helping form the NAACP. Ida B. Wells, she was an African American who led an anti-lynching crusade and called on the federal government to take action. Between 1800 and 1930, almost 5,000 people were lynched in the United States. Most lynchings were against blacks in the South, although some were against whites or Asians. She also spoke out and wrote against this injustice, and later reformers would use her writings to help end this violent act.